Ismail Abdul-Salam, Beats Boxing Mayhem, here with Showtime Sports President Stephen Espinoza, here for the Tank Davis Mario Barrios fight. Just concluded the weigh-in. Packed event as usual. Everybody's very excited. So I wanted to ask you, being that this fight is in the summertime, initially when you guys came down here, it was in the Christmas, right after Christmas, different challenges. Has it been the easier promotion doing it in the summertime with things just opening back up from COVID?
I think that I'm not sure the season makes a lot of effect. I think going into the last Tank fight, we were a little concerned being around the holidays. That was the biggest issue, and that turned out with a gate of 14,000 people, turned out not to be an issue, and Atlanta really turned out.
Right.
I think on this event, I think we'll do better attendance. We'll do a significantly larger gate. Which goes to show you that Tank still sells, and I think part of the excitement is the general excitement. People are outside, now, and it's sort of like, from that regard, I think we're getting a lot of momentum. People are excited about the Hawks. They're excited about opening up. Weather's great, and I think we're trying to tap into that momentum, and so far so good.
Right. And the boxing landscape always changes. I remember initially back in 2019, we were talking about what other fighters could possibly fight in Atlanta. You mentioned Stephen Fulton even back then. You also mentioned Clarissa Shields. Landscape is a little different now. Do you see any other fighters that you could potentially bring down here and eventually grow to Tank size?
I would say Jaron Ennis.
Okay.
I think, and Boots is coming to the fight, and he's still, I'd say, boxing fans and certainly writers and experts know him. The next part is to break him out a little bit more in the casual fans.
Right.
But in terms of a guy who could carry the welterweight division, over the next 5 to 7 years, he's got to be top of the list. And historically, whoever is at the top of the welterweight division is one of the biggest stars in boxing. That typically goes. So I look at him, he's got a strong base in Philly, and I can see him growing the base to the East Coast. He's entertaining, he's flashy. I think Atlanta would be a great move for him.
Gotcha. And the next thing, the Four Kings documentary that recently came out, everybody loved it, brought up a lot of this nostalgia back to the 80s. But on the flip side, boxing is always some negative that has to come out of it. Everybody started looking at the new fighters like, well, why aren't you guys fighting, constantly? Now, people do forget back in the 80s, these fights happened over the span of a decade.
Right.
Do you feel some of the younger fighters like Tank, Teofimo, do you think they're unfairly getting too much pressure, or do you think it is a time now where they should be moving towards fighting each other?
Well, I think you're basically really saying two different things, and or people rather are saying two different things. One is they're not seeing the matchups that they want as frequently as they'd like to, or as frequently as some sort of mythical point in boxing history. And I would say actually we have. Now there's one there's one that sticks out like a sore thumb, and that's Mayweather-Pacquiao, and everybody waiting for that, and I'll grant you that. But if we look at the landscape, what has happened, what is happening, when you see, for example, the run that Errol Spence has been on, who has been, Porter and Garcia and now Pacquiao, you are seeing top 5 guys against top 5 guys. When you see, we're doing 4 unification fights, between, starting from last fall when we saw Jermall versus Rosario, then we're going, through Jermall versus Castaño for an undisputed. We had the unification coming up with Donaire and Casimero, and anytime you are getting unifications and 4 in the span of 12 months, that means the best fighters are in fact fighting the best fighters.
Right.
So I think it's a little nostalgia. People like to say, look, I like the old NBA. There wasn't an NBA like, the Michael Jordan era. Hey, look, I'm having a lot of fun watching Trey and watching Devin Booker, and so it's a little bit of sort of pointing for the past. But if people actually open their eyes, I think those fights are happening. There's always going to be some ones that don't. Maybe it's Spence Crawford, for whatever reason, that doesn't happen. But if we look at everything else, Spence. It's not like Spence is fighting bums. He's fighting top 5 guys, fight in, fight out.
Right. So looking at, we mentioned those unifications. So the main one that stands out to me is when you're looking at that fight, do you foresee it making it easier to possibly unify against Inoue, or do you think it makes it harder because the winner of your unification is going to have a higher profile too? Do you think it's easier to go across the street, or is that not even a factor?
Well, I think I think there's more pressure, to do it, and I think whether Inoue has put on some impressive performances. You really can't ask for more than that. But against the one guy that he's fought that actually has been at the World Championship level before, he was not the same guy. He was not the same guy against Donaire that he's been in the rest of his fights. Now that's arguable. I understand people say it, but that was without question a much closer fight than the vast majority of his fights. So I'm still not completely sold until I see him against, the best of the division. He's fighting solid guys, but whether he wants I don't know that his promoter and him as a whole want a rematch with Donaire. That was a tough fight. And I think, but having 2 of the belts, it makes it easier for it to happen. I think it's more glaring if you've got 3 belts that cost 3 different guys, and you can sort of round robin it, and somebody can get away with it. If you got all the belts over here, and you got one of them here, and this guy with 2 belts is calling you out, wants the fight, it's tougher. So I actually think it increases the chances of that fight happening because it's tougher to avoid. It's a really attractive fight.
Right. And speaking of the Charlo brothers, you mentioned unification coming up with Jermall. Do you feel bad for Jermall? He just had a win, but it seems like it's harder for him to get those bigger fights at middleweight just because of the way the landscape is there. How has his mentality been to you? Does he feel like he needs to move up, or is he comfortable just waiting at 160 until an opportunity comes?
He's frustrated. He's frustrated, and it's not like we haven't. I'm about done of the Andrade topic. I'm done with it, to tell you the truth, because personally, we had a signed piece of paper for way back 2015 for Jermall versus Andrade, and nobody screwed that up other than Andrade. Andrade's the one who walked away from it, by screwing around with some stuff he shouldn't have been screwing around with. So fast forward before Andrade re-signed with DAZN, we made another run at him, this time to match him with Jermall, and started those discussions. And he said it openly, quoting his own words, essentially paraphrasing. I'd rather take $3 million to fight the Luke Keelers of the world. Okay, so if that's the way you want to go with the career, I get it. Big money, low risk. That's not the way to have a good legacy. But having made those 2 decisions at critical points, you've now forfeited the right to say that someone's ducking you. So, that's the one that I think. Look, Golovkin, I get it. Like, if I were in Golovkin's shoes at his age, with the fights that he's been in, I would not be checking for Jermall either. I wouldn't, and I'd sort of give him a pass. At this point, he's had tough fights. I'd love to see it, but I understand completely why it won't happen, because what's in it for Golovkin at this point in his career? But I do think that he will have to move up to get the big fights. And the silver lining on that is the fact that, yes, he will have to move up, but there's not just one good fight, there's several. Whether it's Plant, whether it's Benavidez, potentially Canelo. So you put those all together, that's a great opportunity if he can move up to that, and none of those guys are with the exception, probably of Benavidez is probably the biggest of the 3, but none of them are sort of monster guys that, would be too tough for him to take on.
Got it. Okay, and my last question for you. A lot of people are very impressed with just the whole schedule, how everything was laid out. How difficult was it to decide who was going to be on pay-per-view, especially with all those unifications, and who gets to be on regular Showtime? It always seems like it's interesting, especially when everything is kind of packed together like that. Did you feel comfortable with the consumers being willing to spend, so regularly, even with like a Woodley and Paul fight?
Right.
schedule?
It's a good question, and I actually think that laying out a schedule of a lot of good fights with a pay-per-view or two thrown in there makes it a lot easier to swallow for the consumer.
Right.
Because if you're looking at it and you're saying every time a good fight comes along, then I have to shell out some more money. That's one thing. But if we can lay out a 5-month schedule and some really interesting fights that are not on pay-per-view, and people look at it and say, okay, there's one pay-per-view, maybe two in there, but we've got 4 months of unification fights and really good action fights. Then and you mentioned Fulton earlier before we started, like a Fulton Figueroa, or a Jermall looking for an undisputed championship. On those are not pay-per-view. I think that's I think addresses the fans' concern. The fans' concern is, look, I don't want to watch a bunch of mediocre fights only to get the big fight on pay-per-view. If they're getting a bunch of good fights on Showtime and then occasionally pay-per-view, I think that.
All right. Well, I appreciate your time. Oh, last question, of course. Do you have a prediction for the Tank fight? They're always saying that it's fireworks. Most of them, people are expecting it to go the distance. If it doesn't go the distance, are you seeing an early fight or are you seeing a late fight?
I'm saying a later round stoppage. Somewhere 8, 9, 10.
8, 9, 10.
And the interesting thing is, both of these guys are offensive-minded fighters.
Mm-hmm.
That's not to say that they don't have defense, because they do. But everybody knows, in order to be an offensive-minded fighter, you sometimes throw caution to the wind. You open yourself up. So again, these guys prioritize offense over defense, and that's why I'm so convinced that it's going to be an action fight, because that's the way these guys fight.
Perfect. All right. Appreciate your time, Stephen. See you tomorrow at the weigh-in. Appreciate
Good to see you.
Thank you.